180ths, 4:37 p.m. The Rolls-Royce sped along the highway toward Manhattan. That's an awful lot of money. Edith still sounded incredulous. Not to him, said Barrett, especially when you consider that what he's paying for is an assurance of immortality. But he must know that you don't believe. I'm sure he does, Barrett interrupted. He didn't want to consider the possibility that Deutsch hadn't been told. He's not the sort of man who goes into anything without being totally informed. But $100,000! Barrett smiled. I can scarcely believe it myself, he said. If I were like my mother, I'd undoubtedly consider this a miracle from God. The two things I've failed to accomplish both supplied at once an opportunity to prove my theory and provision for our later years. Really, I could ask no more. Edith returned his smile. I'm happy for you, Lionel, she said. Thank you, my dear. He patted her hand. Monday afternoon, though. Edith looked concerned. That doesn't give us too much time. Barrett said, I'm wondering if I shouldn't go alone on this one. She stared at him. Well, not alone, of course, he said. There are the two others. What about your meals? They'll be provided. All I'll have to do is work. I've always helped you, though, she said. I know. It's just that... What? He hesitated. I'd rather you weren't along this time, that's all. Why, Lionel? She looked uneasy when he didn't answer. Is it me? Of course not. Barrett's smile was quick, distracted. It's the house. Isn't it just another so-called haunted house? She asked, using his phrase. I'm afraid it isn't, he admitted. It's the Mount Everest of haunted houses, you might say. There were 2 attempts to investigate it, one in 1931, the other in 1940. Both were disasters. 8 people involved in those attempts were killed, committed suicide or went insane. Only one survived, and I have no idea how sound he is. Benjamin Fisher, one of the 2 who'll be with me. It's not that I fear the ultimate effect of the house, he continued, trying to ameliorate his words. I have confidence in what I know. It's simply that the details of the investigation may be, he shrugged, a little nasty. And yet you want me to let you go there alone, my dear. What if something happens to you? Nothing will. What if it does, with me in New York and you in Maine? Edith, nothing's going to happen. Then there's no reason I can't go. She tried to smile. I'm not afraid, Lionel. I know you're not. I won't get in your way. Barrett sighed. I know I don't understand much of what you're doing, but there are always things I can do to help. Pack and unload your equipment, for instance. Help you set up your experiments. Type the rest of your manuscript. You said you wanted to have it ready by the 1st of the year, and I want to be with you when you prove your theory. Barrett nodded. Let me think about it. I won't be in your way, she promised, and I know there are any number of things I can do to help. He nodded again, trying to think. It was obvious she didn't want to stay behind. He could appreciate that. Except for his 3 weeks in London in 1962, they'd never been separated since their marriage. Would it really hurt that much to take her? Certainly, she'd experienced enough psychic phenomena by now to be accustomed to it. Still, that house was such an unknown factor. It hadn't been called Hell House without reason. There was a power there strong enough to physically and or mentally demolish 8 people, 3 of whom had been scientists like himself. Even believing that he knew exactly what that power was, dare he expose Edith to it? 10:39 p.m. Florence Tanner crossed the yard which separated her small house from the church and walked along the alley to the street. She stood on the sidewalk and gazed at her church. It was only a converted store, but it had been everything to her these past 6 years. She looked at the sign in the painted window, Temple of Spiritual Harmony. She smiled. It was indeed. Those 6 years had been the most spiritually harmonious of her life. She walked to the door, unlocked it, and went inside. The warmth felt good. Shivering, she turned on the wall lamp in the vestibule. Her eye was caught by the bulletin board. Sunday services 11, 0 a.m. 8 p.m. Healing and Prophecy Tuesdays, 7:45 p.m. Lectures and Spirit Greetings, Wednesdays, 7:45 p.m. Messages and Revelations. Thursdays, 7:45 p.m. Holy Communion. one Saint Sunday of month. She turned and gazed at her photograph tacked to the wall, the printed words above it, the Reverend Florence Tanner. For several moments she was pleased to be reminded of her beauty. 43, she still retained it unimpaired, her long red hair untouched by greyness, her tall, Juno-esque figure almost as trim as it had been in her 20s. She smiled in self-depreciation then. Vanity of vanities, she thought. She went into the church, walked along the carpeted aisle, and stepped onto the platform, taking a familiar pose behind the lectern. She looked at the rows of chairs, the hymnals set on every third one. She visualized her congregation sitting before her. "My dears," she murmured. She had told them at the morning and evening services, told them of the need for her to be away from them for the next week, told them of the answer to their prayers, the means to build a true church on their own property, asked them to pray for her while she was gone. Florence clasped her hands on the lectern and closed her eyes. Her lips moved slightly as she prayed for the strength to cleanse the Belasco house. It had such a dreadful history of death and suicide and madness. It was a house most horribly defiled. She prayed to end its curse. The prayer completed, Florence lifted her head and gazed at her church. She loved it deeply. Still, to be able to build a real church for her congregation was truly a gift from heaven. And at Christmas time, she smiled, eyes glistening with tears. God was good.